Welcome to episode 163 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshul Sag from New York City. So let's get started. You and I, buddy, have been both on the road. I just got back from London. So if I sound a little tired, that's my excuse. But there was some big news, and we didn't want our listeners and viewers to be wanting for our 5G podcast. But let me jump into it. So big news, AST SpaceMobile and AT&T, as well as Vodafone, conducted the first 5G broadband session from space. And this is big, both voice and data. And it represents a huge milestone with respect to satellite communications and the opportunity to bridge the digital divide. So it's funny, I posted this update. I got a lot of feedback on this, like I always do. One of the comments was around just the size of the array of the SpaceMobile low Earth orbit satellites. And I had a pretty spirited discussion around what they're doing, their eventual plans to launch 100 satellites versus Starlink, which is doing 10, on the neighborhood of thousands of satellites. And, from my perspective, the difference really is around the fact that AST SpaceMobile wants to be that middleware, that infrastructure that supports monetization for mobile network operators versus Starlink and some others that want to monetize the service. I know you've got some comments here. I would love to hear them.
Yeah, I think this has really shown, I think, a lot of people in the industry that AST SpaceMobile is a bigger player in the industry than I think people realize. I think it's really enabled them to make it a clear position as a leader in the space, but also that their technology works and that it's not just, a pie in the sky dream. And I think they may have been one of the first in Europe to make this capable. Obviously, maybe not in North America, but it sounds like they're operating both in Europe and in North America. So they clearly have that global coverage. I think a lot of people are expecting from satellite companies. And I'll also add, we also learned recently that Huawei's satellite connectivity is empowered by China Mobile. I think it's China Mobile, might be China Telecom, but they're using Jio for theirs. I wouldn't necessarily expect to see, AST working with a Huawei necessarily, but it was just something that I thought would be a good fit, considering that we're talking about satellite connectivity on smartphones.
No, it's super relevant, and it's interesting. So the relationship with AST SpaceMobile is with a number of mobile network operators. I think there are over 40, and we've talked about Rakuten. Obviously, this is Vodafone. And what was really interesting about this demo was that it was conducted in a completely dead zone in Hawaii, and that connectivity was between Hawaii and Spain with Vodafone. So it's exciting, to see what they're doing here and really sort of enabling device support that doesn't require, any modification. And it was a Samsung device, and, Samsung has been participating in these prior demos as well. The other milestone was around, I believe it was an LTE voice call. And so I think, they're making great strides and great progress. And certainly AST SpaceMobile, they have a lot of work to do. They've only got a few birds in the air, but, their goal again over time is to have 100. But that's, relative to SpaceX, that I think today has 4,000 or 5,000 satellites in the air, and they have designs to launch more in the future. So yeah, no, it's super exciting. And I think, there are other satellite companies that are wanting to sort of mimic what AST SpaceMobile is doing, but it's super, super exciting. But with that, let's go to your first topic, and you want to provide an update on something that we talked about and we took a victory lap on around Apple and some of the stumbles they've had with developing their own 5G modem. So I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, so this thing keeps evolving. It's really interesting because I believe this was a Wall Street Journal story, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And they basically went out and talked to a lot of people who were involved in Apple's modem development from the early on phase, as well as, current, and got a lot of sources. I think there were some things that may have been missed in the analysis that I think would have been valuable, like talking more about how Intel was partnering with Apple and supplying them and failed to do so, which eventually caused Intel to sell off its division to Apple.
Hmm.
And how Intel was continually failing to deliver and continually failing to compete with what Qualcomm was offering, and eventually Apple dumped them. So that's, I think, a really valuable thing to know when you see that Apple is struggling to deliver its own modem, most likely using a lot of this same IP.
Hmm.
I feel like now at this point they're probably pretty deep into developing their own IP. But I think one really crucial thing that I think some people are missing is Apple needs to be spending more money on wireless R&D if it wants to contribute to the IP that exists within the standard, and
Hmm.
to potentially pay less royalties. Because even once they dump Qualcomm to the curb, they're still going to end up having to pay royalties for IP.
Yeah.
And developing new IP is a good way to avoid having to pay out, because you need to cross license and do a lot of things and save some money. Um, but yeah, I think it's really interesting. One of the most interesting lines that I saw in that article, I think a lot of people really attached to, was the fact that some insiders were saying that Apple's modem is 3 years behind Qualcomm's designs, and they did some testing and verifying last year, and they saw that the size, power, performance were all underwhelming, and they decided to delay, which is what we talked about last year when we knew that Apple was going to delay their modem. And then once again, we hear again that they're delaying it again. So,
Yeah.
wireless technologies are not easy. 5G modems are especially hard, especially global 5G modems, like with what Apple needs to deliver. So,
Hmm.
Qualcomm is uniquely positioned to deliver that. I also believe MediaTek is a viable option, but I think that Apple very much wants a partner that can scale to the size that they have, and I'm not sure MediaTek's modem business is there yet.
Yeah.
Um, but it is TSMC, so we'll see what happens. I will say that there's a possibility that they could be having talks already with MediaTek. I
Yeah.
don't have any inside knowledge, but um, I would be surprised if they weren't. And yeah, I just think that this was a really interesting report, because it says that Apple's modem is 5 years or 3 years behind Qualcomm's 5G, and that's a pretty significant number when you consider how fast the mobile industry moves.
Well, I mean, it's a huge number when you just like equate it in technology, right? So I kind of equate, you know, 1 year in technology is the equivalent to 10 years in another industry. Like you can call it dog years and that sort of thing. And, Apple has a history of, being very closed. That's beneficial because it ensures very tight compatibility
Yeah,
with respect to hardware and apps and that sort of thing. But I really think, with respect to developing a 5G modem, that they're finally realizing that, to your point, it's difficult, it's not easy, and a partnership, even with Qualcomm, who they've had a very storied history with, is necessary so that they can remain viable. We've seen the damage that the entity listing has done to Huawei and prevented them from accessing technology and that sort of thing. And so, certainly, iPhone is, a very formidable, platform, when you compare it to, you know, Android. And so like they're going to continue to have to, maintain a leadership position, and, a partnership as far as it comes, with 5G is going to be, completely necessary to their success long term. Just my personal opinion there. But again, my jet lag is kicking in here, so I'm going to try to struggle through this, and we'll get through our podcast. But I want to go to my second topic this week, and I'll be at Mobile World Congress Las Vegas next week, and be doing a number of things there. One of them is spending time with T-Mobile. I'm a judge for their unconventional awards. This is for T-Mobile for Business, and I am a judge with three others, and it includes, two industry luminaries as well as a T-Mobile executive. And we're going to really recognize, very unconventional thinking and the way that, municipalities and companies in general are leveraging and leaning into 5G technology. So I'm super excited about that. But, as far as my expectations, no surprise, I think AI is going to be on the forefront. There's been a lot of discussion around AI and its application to telecom and how that can improve not only the subscriber experience, but provide efficiencies within telecommunications operations. So I think AI will be a big highlight at the event. And I know that you've got a conflict and you won't be able to attend this year, unfortunately, but I just want to sort of get your thoughts and insights on what you're expecting to see at the show.
Well, I have multiple conflicts actually. So,
Yeah,
I would love to be in three places at once, but unfortunately I can't be. So I will also be missing the Oculus Connect event. We'll be announcing the Quest 3, or sorry, Meta Connect. I forgot.
yeah,
Oculus is dead. But basically, I think we're going to see a lot more talk about standalone because AT&T and Verizon are going to really make a big push next year, I believe, now that their 5G networks are near completion in terms of spectrum availability and rollout. And I just
yeah.
think you're going to see standalone. AT&T and Verizon are going to join the T-Mobile symphony, talking about standalone and what that enables.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you. I mean, standalone should be huge. I think we're also going to hear a lot about private networking and specifically, double clicking into private networking. I'm expecting to hear some things from industry leaders like Solana and that sort of thing around neutral host. I mean, that, neutral host is really emerging as a very compelling private 5G use case. And I got a little bit of exposure to that when I was with Circuit of the Americas, about a week ago before I was in London last week at Connected Britain. But I think it'll be an interesting event. Too bad I won't see you, buddy, but I'll make sure that on our next podcast that I provide a full sort of readout on what I found compelling, and there'll probably be a Forbes article that follows there as well. So, but let's go to your second topic. You want to talk about Qualcomm's Wi-Fi Day and 5G fixed wireless access.
Yeah, so I attended Qualcomm's Wi-Fi Day last week, and the announcement came out this week, so I was able to kind of get an idea. This was a lot of Wi-Fi 7 technology. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously this is not necessarily relevant to 5G in a certain way. But the thing is that a lot of what Qualcomm's talking about with Wi-Fi 7 is related to fixed wireless and service providers. So
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of talk about their 5G fixed wireless platform and how that, can deliver multi-gig performance, to the user without having to dig any fiber, but also leveraging Wi-Fi 7 along with 5G in these fixed wireless gateways to enable new use cases and kind of change the landscape. They also talked about some fiber related stuff with a 10 gig gateway that has Wi-Fi 7 in it, which I thought was really interesting. But that's not necessarily a 5G application. But it
Yeah.
was just interesting to hear them talking about all the different ways that Wi-Fi 7 is being utilized. And one thing to consider is also that they're looking to reduce the latency of Wi-Fi to enable more 5G use cases like AR and VR. So there are just some really interesting things that are going on with Wi-Fi 7 that I think will complement what's going on with 5G and make both more useful to developers and users.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a lot of leverage between, next generation Wi-Fi and, the 5G, 3GPP standard, right? So from an architectural standpoint, there's some leverage, right, between the two. So that makes sense.
Wi-Fi 7 finally takes into account the ability to aggregate spectrum for the first
Right.
time. So you can actually aggregate 2.4 with 5 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz with 6 or multiple bands within 5 gigahertz, like if you're in China where there is no 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
So that is called MLO. And that is a really interesting technology because it gives you up to 320 megahertz of spectrum, depending on, what your spectrum roadmap looks like or what your availability is in your region. So there are some
Yeah.
things, but in general, I think they're very complementary to each other, and
Yeah.
it'll be a great thing to see that momentum grow into next year.
I agree. I think, 5G and Wi-Fi are better together. I think I've talked about that on prior podcasts. So, but let me hit my third and final topic, and I want to talk about Ericsson. And they acquired Vonage a few years ago. I'm not exactly sure when, but it was a big announcement. It was, $6 billion. And, at first on the surface, I was like, Vonage, you think of IP phones and like, why would that fit into Ericsson's, wheelhouse? And what Ericsson saw from a value perspective with Vonage was its platform and its capability to bring programmability into what Ericsson is doing from an infrastructure standpoint. And so Ericsson set a vision of offering programmability within its network. And really what that was designed to do is really spur developer innovation and provide a sandbox to develop the next compelling 5G application. And so flash forward recently this week, Ericsson announced a tie-up with Deutsche Telekom. Basically, Deutsche Telekom is signing up to provide basically an API sort of app store scenario. And there was a light reading article that was written about this, and the kind of the headline on it was around, well, hey, it's taken Ericsson this long to do it. They've only got one operator signed up. Is it a failure? And I think what, from my perspective, broadly thinking about it, is that Ericsson's vision to make its network programmable is sound, and that's going to spur developer innovation. That's going to accelerate that next killer application. I've often talked about how ride sharing was birthed, with GPS and with LTE's very predictable connectivity from a throughput standpoint. And so I think more needs to be done along these lines to spur innovation. Now, obviously Ericsson is not a nonprofit company, and they paid $6 billion to acquire Vonage. So you could argue that on the surface, are they getting the right return on investment? Maybe not in the short term, but this could be a longer term play for Ericsson. So I'm not sure if you caught Ian Morris's article, but would love to get your input on it.
I did not. Sorry, I did not catch his article, but I would agree with your assessment that I don't think in the short term that it's been realized.
Yeah.
I think that it will probably take a lot longer to make that assessment, and I hope that Ericsson is patient enough and their investors are impatient enough to allow that to realize itself long term. But I will say, it's still a pretty good fit. I'm not sure it's as good as the fit of, say Cisco with Splunk.
Yeah.
But I still think it's a pretty good fit. I think the Cisco Splunk thing is like kind of like a marriage made in heaven.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't have any opinions in the short term. I do think it's kind of hard to justify any kind of investment when it's that big. In the short term, but in the long term, I think in a few years, I think maybe we'll have a better idea.
That's a good point. I mean, you got to think long term, and I'm glad you brought up Cisco and Splunk. I mean, it's not directly related to our 5G podcast, but although Cisco does have a significant service provider business, I will let our viewers and listeners know that I'll be publishing a Forbes article likely on Monday. Robert Kramer, our newest analyst that's joined More Insights and Strategy, did contribute. He's our enterprise data expert. And so I penned an article around observability and where I think the value lies with a Splunk and Cisco tie-up. It is quite compelling. This broke when I was in London. I was sitting in a pub having a beer when I got the note. So I was not predisposed on this. I mean, obviously, there were rumors that were circulating around, who might buy Splunk. I mean, apparently Splunk was shopping itself, but it is a great fit. There is a service provider play, and I would encourage our viewers and listeners to check out that Forbes article when it posts on Monday. At Willtown Tech is where you can find it. But let's go to your third and final topic. You want to talk about Reliance in India, and they're launching a fiber service. It's an FWA 5G service, and it's leveraging a standalone network. Now, dude, this is crazy because India has been pretty far behind, right? And, when you look at, when their 5G auctions occurred, we've been talking about this for years. And then all of a sudden, they're launching an FWA service with standalone. I mean, I didn't catch this news, so like I'm dying to hear like your thoughts.
So it's really interesting. I kind of saved the best for last, in my opinion, other than my earlier rant about Apple. But the interesting part is, you're right. They have made up a lot of ground very quickly. AT&T launched their fixed wireless service not too long ago, so
Yeah.
they've made up a lot of time. What's really interesting about this is, the company thinks that they'll be able to reach 200 million potential households with this service. They launched it in 8 cities, including Delhi, Ahmedabad, Bengaluru, Chennai, Hyderabad, and Kolkata, Mumbai, and Pune. So they've hit the big cities.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about the service is it's a tiered service. So they're calling it JioAirFiber, which is very similar to like what AT&T is doing with their service and how they're calling it that.
Internet. Yeah. AT&T is calling theirs Internet
AT&T
Air,
Internet Air,
and they are
right?
claiming AT&T is claiming that they're standalone. That's a part of that deployment for them as well.
Exactly. I saw
Yeah.
that too. So
Yeah.
what's interesting is they're offering a 30 megabit service for $7 a month. And then they're also offering a 100 megabit service for $10 a month. And then they're also offering a service that you can opt in for some OTT channels as well. And then in addition to that, they have an JioAirFiber Max program, which is 300, 500, and 1,000 megabits per second.
Hmm.
And the gig speed is $40 a month. So, $40 a month for a gig, not bad at all.
Not bad.
Obviously, in India, that's probably pretty pricey when you consider like what other people are used to paying for internet service there. But
Hmm.
even then, 300 is $18 a month and 500 is $30 a month. So those are very affordable and reasonable price. Um, and yeah, they're really moving fast with this, and I think they're gonna, give a lot more people access to internet that maybe they wouldn't have been able to have otherwise. Because in India, there's obviously a lot of fiber, but there's
Yeah.
also a lot of places that don't have fiber. So I think they're gonna actually be able to fill a lot of gaps with this service, and they're already one of the biggest fiber providers in the country, with 9 million subscribers for fiber service. So
Right.
I think this actually might end up being a lot bigger than their current fiber service.
Hmm.
And I think their fiber service is around the same size as AT&T's is right now. So
Huh.
it's really interesting to see how they are leveraging 5G fixed wireless to accelerate their growth, and increase access to customers, and give customers choice. And they have
Yeah.
competition in India, so they're not going to jack up prices on people like we would in other markets. But
Yeah.
realistically, this is a huge win for them. And I think it's going to only continue that fixed wireless momentum for the industry and pump up those numbers, in addition to what T-Mobile and Verizon are doing in the US.
Yeah, FWA continues to be sort of a killer 5G use case, and Reliance Jio, I mean, they continue to be disruptive in that India market. And, they're leaning into disaggregated infrastructure and Open RAN and, cloud native architectures to deliver this service. And, it's quite compelling. And there are, more entrenched competitors like the Bharti, Airtels of the world. And, from my perspective, Reliance is sort of like this disruptor, with T-Mobile in the US and delivering tremendous value. I mean, those prices are very aggressive. I mean, and obviously in India, it's a developing, geography and nation, but it's still very compelling on the surface. So it's exciting to see what Reliance is doing in that market. And again, competition, breeds innovation. I always like to state that on these podcasts. So exciting stuff. But I mean, I know you've been on the road. I just got back from London. I'm about to do a turnaround. I'll be in New
Same.
York with Fastly and then with T-Mobile and at Mobile World Congress. So probably not my best performance on the podcast, but you know what, buddy? We got one in. You're in New York, and I'm back in Austin just for a day or so. But another great podcast. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insights on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Willtown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sag. We hope you have a great week, and please don't forget to rate and subscribe.